Good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and I'm here with another of our virtual events this afternoon. And today, we're very excited. It's kind of a 2-for-1 special today. We're very excited to welcome Scottish author Carole Johnstone with her new book, Mirrorland, which is getting raves. We were just talking about it from all over the place. Just a wonderful debut. Nice blurb by Stephen King here. And then our good friend and best-selling author, Jayne Anne Krentz, who this is her latest novel, and I still have a dwindling supply of signed copies left. So act now. But this is her new book, All the Colors of Night. And, you know, as Amanda Quick, she has another book coming out called The Lady Has a Past, and she'll be doing one of these virtual events with us on May the 8th. So anyway, Jayne, really appreciate you coming in as a guest host. Some of these pairings are fun, you know, to put together two different writers and see how they interact. It's a really nice idea. So welcome both of you. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
And what I'll be doing, everybody watching on Facebook, I'll be monitoring the Facebook comments. So if you have questions for Carole or Jayne, go ahead and put them in the comments field, and I will magically reappear on screen, I don't know, about 40 minutes in to ask some of your questions. So Jayne, I'm going to turn it over to you.
This is it. This is my big chance.
This is your chance.
Fame and glory here. And I couldn't get it off with a better start than with you, Carole. I am so thrilled to be talking to you today. I was absolutely fascinated with Mirrorland. Actually, from the title in, I think what a great title that was. I envy great titles. So anyhow, thank you so much for letting me interview you. And I've got to ask you just from the get-go, you have an absolutely fantastic ability for narrative and description. They use the term making word pictures on the page, but you really do it. You do more than that. You do world building in a really amazing way. So I just, author to author, I want to ask you right off the bat, talk to me a little bit about your process. How did you do it? Asking for a friend.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for talking to me today as well. But thank you so much for what you just said. That's lovely. Oh gosh, process. It's quite long-winded, I suppose. I've always written, and when I was a teenager and in my 20s, I just couldn't finish a novel. I was desperate to write a novel. It's all I wanted to do, and I couldn't finish them. I would always either see another great idea that I wanted to write instead, or you know, it would just get out of control. I wouldn't be able to drive it towards the end. And I remember around about the mid-2000s, I read Stephen King's book on writing, which is kind of part memoir, part writing guide. I loved Stephen King by that point anyway. I sort of read everything that he wrote. And through reading that, I decided to kind of shelve novel writing completely and just try and write short stories. And so that's what I did for the next 10 years plus. I just wrote short stories and nothing else. I had them published mainly in the US and in the UK. And I think that short story writing, you know, it taught me, it's a different media, obviously, from writing a novel, but it taught me a lot of things that I think it would have taken me many more years to discover otherwise. You know, it helped me see how to write something that has a lot of pace, how to get to the point very quickly. I mean, obviously, with a short story, you don't have a great deal of words. You have to make every word count. So you have to be able to write a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, but you have to be able to do it very concisely, very precisely. And I think as well, it taught me how to become my own best editor, which I think was my biggest problem. I couldn't finish a novel because I could never work out where I was going wrong what I had to change, what I had to delete, when I had to stop and kind of regroup. So I sort of did that for a very long time. And then I had this idea for a story. I wanted to write about estranged identical twins. I wanted to write a story about a decades-long love triangle. I love love triangles. I wanted to write about a very sort of dark and disturbing house because I love Gothic stories. And I wanted to write about a big kind of terrifying secret because I love mystery stories. And I knew immediately that I couldn't write that as a short story. I couldn't write it as a novella. I couldn't write it as anything other than a novel. So I knew that I would have to sort of start all over again and try this time to write a novel. But I knew that Mirrorland is quite a complex story, and there are an awful lot of twists and turns throughout it, some of them quite early on. There's like a very big twist about halfway through. And I knew before I even started that I would need to plot it. There was absolutely no way that I could just sit down and write it. I would have to plot it out. And I'm quite a sort of compulsive list maker in real life anyway. Actually, once I started going, it was actually quite easy. So I sort of had the ending first. I always was very clear on where I wanted it to end. I wrote a kind of synopsis of the whole book, and then I broke it down chapter by chapter by chapter by chapter, exactly what needed to happen, when I needed to put clues in, when I needed to introduce certain people, when I needed to introduce certain ideas, when I needed things to happen. And I did that all the way through the book. And then I went back to the beginning and I did it all again. But I did maybe a couple of pages per chapter. This is actually what I need to write down, every single chapter. And then after that, I did all the research that I needed to do, and all of this took months and months. I think probably the planning and the plotting of it took maybe 3 months minimum. And then after that, I was ready to do the first draft. And that probably took me another 3 months. So I think I know
It's
not a lot of
it's an involved process. And I can, in my mind, when I read it, I had the feeling that you were seeing the book visually. I am not a visual writer. I'm a totally dialogue driven writer. So when I come up against anything that requires description, I freak out. But you have obviously a gift for it, as well as the dialogue. But I also wondered if maybe that's the way you saw the book. Those word pictures were how you saw it, like a film almost.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was going to say, that I do see it like a film. I very much certain scenes. I have a screenwriter friend who said, you should try doing this. Just imagine because it will let you see what you should keep in, and it will let you see what's not actually that interesting and doesn't need to be there. And the minute I started doing that, even writing short stories, that's all I've ever done since then, because it is a really easy tool. You can look at something, particularly something that's quite complicated or something that's quite weird, like the world of Mirrorland that Kat and Elle create. It's weird, but you can look at it and you can say, oh, this works, this doesn't work. So you're a bit like a director. You're not really part of it, but you're kind of moving things, that you're ordering everything around, and
I need to get better at that. Thank you for the tip. I'm going to work on that. One of the things that struck me, I'm sure everybody who reads the book, was the wonderful way you play with memory and imagination. I think we all know on some level that our imaginations can warp and change our memories, or we can fit the memory somehow to make it different if we want to. And you took that notion and ran with it in this story, but you did it flawlessly in the sense that I think everybody could identify with it on some, not with such maybe dramatic secrets that you were discussing, but we all know that we really deep down can't really trust a lot of our memories because we have rewritten and re-scripted them. So what led you to that? But is that a personal interest of yours, or was it just the plot that you wanted to work with? What pulled you?
It's probably a bit of both. I think that the house that Mirrorland is set in, 36 West Street Road, the house that the sisters grow up in, was very much based on my grandparents' house in Leith in Edinburgh. It's really, really the same. I mean, originally when I wanted to write it, I wanted to set it in this great big Gothic mansion in the middle of nowhere, you know, like a proper kind of Gothic story. But every time I sat down to do anything, my grandparents' house was the house that I saw. And it wasn't a huge house, but it was a very eccentric house. It was a 200-year-old Georgian house. And it's in Leith, which is the kind of northern port district of Edinburgh. And it was just a really, really strange house. My sister and I spent every holiday there when we were kids in the kind of 80s and 90s. And a lot of the elements of 36 West Street Road in the book are pretty much lifted wholesale from my grandparents' house. So they had, you know, every room in the house was just crammed full of mismatched antique furniture. You couldn't move for stuff. Every wall was covered in pictures and plates, you know, the Chinese plates. There was a bar in the kind of living room, drawing room. It was a very kind of 20s style Art Deco bar, and that became the Poirot in Mirrorland. And they even had a servant bell pull system in the house. It was slightly newer. It was a Victorian bell pull system. And in Mirrorland, I used the kind of one that they have in Downton Abbey, you know, where they have bell pulls in the bedroom. Yeah. And then they have the big bellboard in the kitchen, in the servants' quarter. And then depending on who's rung their bell, that's where you have to go, you know. So all of those things I took from my grandparents' house. And really the main kind of plot of Mirrorland came from something that happened in that house as well to me when I was a child. There was this room in my grandparents' house at the very back of the house. It was a very kind of dark, dingy, small, kind of forgotten room at the very back of the house. And my gran called it the sewing room. It was where she did all her mending. There was a sort of Singer sewing machine, and that was all it was used for. And at the very, very back of this room, there was a huge wooden cupboard that you could climb up into. It was just vast. And we played a lot of hide and seek in the house. And that was my favorite hiding place. That was where I always went. And I have this very, very vivid memories of hiding in that cupboard. And at the very back of the cupboard was a door, a full-sized, normal-sized door just in the back of this cupboard. And, you know, I can remember exactly what it looked like. It had 4 vertical panels. It was painted white. It had a ceramic, you know, those ceramic round handles that kind of rattle when you turn them. And it was always locked, you know, and I knew that this wall was the outside.
Okay, I'm scared already.
I love this door. I used to think, why is it there? You know, why is this door there? And I knew that it was the outside wall of the house. You know, I knew that it couldn't go anywhere. What it led to was an alleyway that ran alongside the house. And the back of the house was on much lower ground than the front of the house. So I also knew that this door was in midair. It was lots of feet above the ground. And yet I was convinced that one day, you know, it would be unlocked, because obviously I'd read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. This was exactly the same thing, you know. And then years later, when I was thinking about setting a story in that house, I remember mentioning the door to my mum, and that's the house that she grew up in. And she sort of said to me, of course, there wasn't a door in the back of that cupboard, you know, that would just be really strange. And I remember just being really, really shocked, you know, shocked that it didn't exist, but also shocked that I'd never questioned the fact that it was there. You know, it's a really, really, really vivid memory to me. It's hugely, you know, even now I can see it. If I really want to, if I close my eyes, I can see the story. And so that was really the final kind of plot point of the book, if you like. It made me become fascinated with memory, like you were saying at the very beginning of this question, about false memories and, you know, childhood memories, how memories are made. And I discovered through sort of doing lots of research that everybody's memories are false, you know, to some degree. As soon as you recall a memory, you change it. And depending on why you've decided to think of it again, you know, if you, whatever emotions you're feeling at the time, you change it, you change your perception of it, you change your interpretation of it, and it overwrites that original memory, so that the next time you remember it, you remember this new version, you don't remember the proper original version. And that happens every single time that you do it. So the big memories, the significant memories in your life, if you like, the ones that you remember again and again and again, they're the ones that you can trust the absolute least, you know, because they're the ones that have changed so much. There's a French neurologist and psychiatrist. He's absolutely huge in France, this huge household name in France. And he has this theory about childhood resilience. He spent his entire life looking at childhood memories and resilience. He's actually a really interesting person himself. He had a very traumatic childhood. So his parents were killed in the Holocaust, and he was subsequently brought up by very neglectful foster parents who didn't treat him very well at all. And around about kind of age 7, he was recruited as a runner. He had to cross enemy lines to deliver messages to the French army. You know, he had a very, very interesting but incredibly traumatic childhood. But he puts down his very happy and successful life to this idea of childhood resilience, that some children are able to survive trauma, to survive really huge events in their childhood by using fantasy, by using false memory, so that they can get through the event itself, and then they can subsequently kind of explain it to themselves. They can process it that way, and then they can then kind of go on to have either very good lives or very strange lives, depending on whether or not at some point they are able to process it in reality. So that was really the ball started with the cupboard, the door in the back of the cupboard, and then it just kind of, I mean, you're probably the same. You get this one little idea, and then everything else just kind of rolls on from that.
Yeah, I think it's sort of, for me, it's a process of asking questions. I ask one question, like, what's the door doing in the back of the cupboard? And then, yeah, I think that's probably how writers' minds should work.
Yeah.
I've always felt that we write these books, most of us, I shouldn't say everybody, but most of the writers I know write the books for themselves first. They're telling the story to themselves first. And I'm assuming it's that way for you too, that sense, you know when it's done. You are the one that knows when it's right. What was your biggest, I got lots of questions, but before we get too much farther into it, what would you say what was the biggest difference between writing the short story and then doing the full-length novel? Because it is a very different medium. What did you learn from it or take away from it that taught you what the difference was between those two formats, or gave you some insight into it?
I think the main thing is that you want, especially if you're writing a suspense, you want to create this pace that keeps going all the way through, but that's massively difficult to do if you've got quite a complicated story to tell that you want to make look simple, or if you have lots of kind of twists and things throughout. So what I think, that's why I broke it down to chapters, because I think in my head I thought it's just like writing lots of little short stories, you know. and you're right, it is a completely different process, but at the same time it's quite similar. I think that the thing that I found the hardest was that it can get out of your control very easily. It can become so unwieldy really quickly. And unless you're kind of able to recognize it, even if you've plotted it to the extent that I did, you can still find yourself going way off piste, and you have to kind of stop and go.
Been there and done that. Yeah, it's like, I always say, it's like juggling chainsaws. You know, I mean,
Yeah, I always say it's like herding cats. It's like the same thing.
Yeah, well, it looks like we have the same going issue going there.
Yeah.
Which brings me to another subject, which is of current interest to me, especially this past year, because I've been reading so much of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's this new, although it's not so new now, it's been around a few years, a couple of years now at least. They're calling it psychological suspense, but it really feels to me like the new Gothic. I have this thing where I'm convinced that there are no new genres. We just reinvent them for each generation. Sure. And I feel like right now, you and other writers are reinventing the Gothic in a way that's modern and contemporary, like the issues of memory and imagination and things that probably wouldn't have been dealt with in the same way 40, 50 years ago in another kind of Gothic, but they work perfectly for today's reader. And at the heart of it, no matter what you do, there's always this really big house. There's always this house. And that's, to me, what makes it such an intensely intimate story. Did you even think of doing it without a house? Was there even?
Do you know what? I didn't.
My point, exactly.
I mean, the second book that I'm doing now doesn't have a house in, and I hope it's still Gothic. But yeah, I think that I actually started out wanting Mirrorland to be a psychological thriller. That's what it was supposed to be. Just a straight up psychological thriller.
It is that.
And but I think that when I started doing it, because I just love Gothic fiction, I think so many people love it. It's always going to keep coming back. You know, it's the kind of thing that everybody loves to read. And you're right. I think part of the reason for that is because it's so intimate. I mean, I completely loved The Haunting of Hill House when I first read it, by Shirley Jackson, but I completely loved as well the TV series. You know, they're massively different, but I think that came back because it's just coming back. I think that partly because of the way the world is today, you know, I mean, it's very difficult. Everything is accessible and everything is kind of open. And then obviously we've got the pandemic that's kind of changed everything for everyone as well. And I think that probably what people really want right now is escapism, is something other than what we've got. And I think that Gothic fiction, partly because it's a kind of harking back to classic kind of fiction, and the kind of mysteries like Agatha Christie, the kind of golden age of mystery writing, but also partly just because people kind of want something that's a bit less, that is contemporary, but is also a bit less contemporary, that you can completely sort of lose yourself in. Because I think escapism is really why we read anything at all. And I think that Gothic fiction, if it's mixed with things like psychological thrillers or whodunits, or, you know, even love stories and romance, or even fantasy, even magic realism, all that kind of stuff, the Gothic kind of element of it is the bit I think that people, well, certainly the bit that I love the most. And I think that I would struggle to write a psychological thriller that wasn't slightly Gothic. It wasn't intentional. It's just what happened, you know?
So, which brings up the point, where are you going next? What have you got? What are you working on now? What's the project?
So I actually signed a 2-book deal with my UK publishers, Borough Press, which is an imprint of HarperCollins, and they've told me I can't say too much about it, but it's okay. It's a very unusual murder mystery. I can't tell you why it's unusual. That's the thing I'm not allowed to say.
Okay. No secrets, no secrets.
No
Yeah.
secrets.
But you are
But
working
yeah,
on something else. It is coming.
I am, and it's set in the Outer Hebrides, which is an island chain off the west coast of Scotland. It's I think it's about 40 miles or so west of Scotland. It's as far west as you can go before you're no longer in Scotland. So they're quite a remote chain of islands. I know them very well. I actually was living there part of the time when I was writing Mirrorland, and had the idea for the second book because it's another place that is very Gothic. It's very atmospheric. It's very wild. It's one of these places it doesn't have internet really in a lot of areas. It has no phone signal. You know, a lot of the time when you watch films and they have no phone signal when something terrifying is about to happen, and everyone goes, oh, of course they would have a phone signal. You know, in the Outer Hebrides, you really wouldn't. You know, so it's a really good. It's a good place to set a sort of scary book.
Yeah. I will just say, speaking on behalf of somebody who's been writing for a while, the worst thing that ever happened to plots was the cell phone. It's like, oh no, take that away, take that away.
Yeah, and Google as well. People can find out so much that otherwise they wouldn't be able to find out.
Yeah, we tend to treat the tech in the books in a lot of mysteries and stuff. The tech gets used either as the magic, you know, that's what the magic. You find something online that tells you where to go next or something like that. Or it gets used as the villain. You know, it's going to be the destroyer in the scene. It's difficult to work with. And make it realistic in a sense. Phones do lose. I lost my connection to my brother this morning. It happens.
Yeah.
It happens.
Yeah. It does, but they never accept that as an excuse, you know.
Yeah, it's an excuse. I've got some notes here. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. What do you think? There's a huge fascination with the link between twins, which you pulled on beautifully in this book. And we're all kind of fascinated because that's like one step closer than sister. You know, it's an intimacy that if you're not in a twin, you can imagine it, but you can't really experience it. It's unique. Is that something you pulled in because of you just wanted to work with sisters, or was it part of the big secret all along?
It was a bit of both, really. Again, I think that twins, especially identical twins, they're written about so often in fiction because of exactly what you're saying. They have a very unique perspective. They are different from the rest of us. They have incredibly strong bonds. So you always have to wonder, what would it take to break them? You know, what event, what thing? Mirror twins in particular are really interesting. They're exact mirror reflections of each other. So they're not identical, they're oppositely identical. That makes sense. One of them might be right-handed and the other left-handed. Everything is opposing, including sometimes their behaviors. I don't think there's an awful lot that's known about them, but what is known is that their egg, or the egg that makes them, splits much later than it would, say, for an identical twin. I think it's something I can never remember the exact. It's something between 7 and 10 days after conception. It's quite late, and if it sort of waited any longer, they would become conjoined twins. Oh. So they're what happens right before you would get a conjoined twins. So because of that, their bond is exceptionally close. Mirror twins report a lot of extrasensory perception, you know, feeling each other's physical and emotional pain. And that's something that we can't ever hope to kind of understand. So they're really interesting to write about from that perspective. And from a personal point of view, I've always really wanted to write about twins. My mum is an identical twin. And my husband is a fraternal twin. So I'm kind of like surrounded by twins.
Research.
So I know, and I suppose it's quite lazy really, because I've set the book in my grandparents' house. And I've used my poor mum who grew up there with her identical twin sister, you know, so I've used a lot of things that I knew, but also things that I know really work in stories. I love stories about twins, and I love stories about scary houses, and I love stories about love triangles, you know, so I just kind of lumped everything that I love into a book.
Well, I'm convinced that that's where writers get their power. You know, it comes from whatever you're passionate about and love and are fascinated with, and in either on the horrific side or the fabulous side or whatever. It's, if it's not fascinating to you, it's not going to be fascinating to the reader. It's just not going to come out on the page that way. So yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, and you just have such a gift for this kind of story that you're ashamed to waste it. I'm looking at my notes here to make sure I don't forget anything. I think one of the other things I like about the Gothic novel, and this is that no matter how it's written, ultimately the biggest threat, the evil, the danger, and the salvation itself come from the heart of the family. It's all within the family that the greatest danger lurks, and also the hope comes from that. And I'm assuming, can I assume that that was a pull for you too, that that's where the intimacy comes from, that family?
Definitely. I mean, I think that family, it's one of those things that you're stuck with your family. There's absolutely nothing you can do about it, but they know things about you that no one will ever know. You know, if the bonds that you have, like it or not, you know, you will have forever. And if it turns toxic, if it goes bad, then that's, you know, 10 times worse almost than any other relationship, because you share so much. I know that when I read books or when I watch films, that's the thing that really always gets me the most is family. I mean, I had a lovely childhood. We've got a very close family, but I can imagine how awful it must be if you don't, and how awful it must be to if something dreadful has happened, something that you all share, and maybe somebody doesn't want to talk about it, but somebody else does, you know, that is a bond that you will always have forever and ever. I mean, I'm sort of going back to The Haunting of Hill House again, as the TV series. I actually was more kind of drawn towards them as a family, that they're the very sort of complex, difficult relationships that they had, more than Hill House itself, you know, more than what happens there. I think it's more interesting. I'm just really, really interested in people. I think that people are fascinating. I love to see why people do certain things. I'm such a sort of, I'm really nosy. I always want to know what's going on inside people's relationships, and particularly inside people's families, because they're all so different. The dynamics are so different, and it is massively interesting to write about. And you are, especially if you're a twin, for example, you are stuck with that person, like it or not. Even if you can't stand each other, you will never have a more important relationship than that one, you know. So yes, definitely family is a huge draw for me. I think that no matter what I would write, that's what I would write about.
Well, I know that at the start of the pandemic, when families were forced into closer proximity than they had probably, at least in our culture, they had anticipated or expected or planned for. That could be one explanation for the huge popularity of this new kind of Gothic. I mean, it's like, this is my life.
Yeah.
It could be worse. Look.
Yeah.
But one of the things that happens in the Gothic too, and in this book, is there is a coming to terms with the past. There is yes, you don't remember it correctly, but you're going to have to deal with it and move on. That there is somehow there's a way forward, and I think that's part of the brilliance of fiction. That's what fiction gives us, is a path out.
Yes, and I don't necessarily think that you have to write happy ending. I don't think that every story needs to have a happy ending, but I do think you need to give the reader something at the end. You need to give them something kind of hopeful or redemptive. To read a novel, it's a big commitment. It's a lot of investment of your time and your emotions, hopefully. And by the end of it, I don't just want a reader to kind of enjoy my story. I want them to feel something. I want them to take something away afterwards. I want to kind of entertain them, but I also want to, I don't know, I don't, I was going to say I want to make them happy, but that's a bit twee. It's not what I mean. I want them to feel good about life in general, and I think that's, it's probably why you write. It's why I write. We write to entertain people. We write for other people. I mean, I enjoy doing it. I would probably still do it even if no one was reading it, but it wouldn't be the same, It
is an odd sort of mix of a very incredibly personal journey and then one that you share. It is, and in my experience, the readers never take away what you think they're going to take away. What do you think readers are? What if you had? From the feedback you're getting, what do you think readers are picking up on the most? What is there, like one or two elements that they really respond?
I think there's a couple of things, and one of them was quite surprising. But the first thing I think was that they really like the twists and the reveals. I'm personally, I'm not a huge fan of a book that just has a great big huge twist at the climax, because a lot of the time the book up until that point is all just driving its way towards this big twist. And so a lot of the rest of the book can be a bit strange or, a bit boring sometimes. So I personally prefer books to have lots of little twists all the way through. And that's what I try to do. So that's one of the main things that people have said that they like. They like being sort of wrong-footed, and they like the fact that all the way through. And it's really good to know that works, because when you're writing, you don't really know for sure. That's the one thing that you can never know if it's going to work or not. So I think it hasn't worked all the time, but I think, a lot of the time it has. So that was one thing. But the other thing that I wasn't expecting, and I was actually much more apprehensive about, was the world of Mirrorland. So sort of half the book, obviously, is this present day narrative of Kat as a grown-up coming back to Scotland, doing this treasure hunt that she believes Elle has left, trying to find out what has happened to Elle. Elle has gone missing. And then the other part of the narrative is the past narrative, is their childhood, and this world of Mirrorland that they created underneath the house. And that was the part that I was a bit worried about, because I thought that people might be I'm expecting a psychological thriller here, and I've got this what I suppose is a bit like magic realism, a bit fantasy-like. And a lot of the reviews that I've been seeing sort of say, I wasn't too sure about this bit. I started reading it, I was thinking, I don't know if I'm going to like this extra sort of storyline. And then they've kind of said, well, once it started making sense, once I realized why it was there, I really liked it. And so some of the feedback, not always, but some of the feedback that I've been getting is, it's something that I haven't read before in a psychological thriller, and that's why I really liked it, because it is quite a big risk. You're taking, or I was taking, the reader in a direction that they maybe weren't expecting to go, that you're kind of asking them to stick with it. And so I'm really glad. I'm really glad that it's worked. I'm really glad that it doesn't work for everyone, but I'm really glad that it has worked when it has worked, if you see what I mean. Because I think that was the bit that I was the most concerned about, because it is the bit that's most different, I suppose, to a psychological thriller, as you would be expecting.
Well, and it takes it over the top, which in my theory is that's what fiction is for, is to go over the top. That's what it's all about. And people do want to be surprised. If you hadn't put it in there, they probably would have said, well, this is one more Gothic novel.
Yeah.
You couldn't win on that one. But
no.
But ultimately they do want the surprise. They do want that sense of, oh, of amazement, and I think it works in this book so well because when you do get it, you totally identify with it. You understand instantly that you've done this too. Maybe not to this degree, but you know what this is about. This is how I have used this. It's kind of revelatory in the sense that it's like that. Oh, I've done that. I know
Yeah.
I've done that. Yeah, I've had that kind of magical fantasy experience and maybe used it differently, but you know what the feeling is. So then at that point, I think you've pulled the reader in and you're on the same page. Literally, you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
They know what you're doing and they like it. So
Yeah.
oh,
Oh, thank you.
I thought I'd come on
You're
back.
back. Yes.
Yeah. It's funny because I've been wanting to jump in. And it's like, wow, what a fascinating discussion. It's really been a treat listening to you guys. It's
Two
funny
authors.
on the what's that?
You get two authors together and they just
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's funny on the subject of twins. That is an endlessly interesting thing to discuss. And we have customers here at the bookstore, these two women who are, I guess they're probably in their 70s now, and they're identical twins. And, it's always dangerous bringing up politics in this time and place, but each one of them is decidedly on the opposite side of the tracks. And it is very amusing to see them navigate that. All right, let me turn this off. And also, it was funny. There's an author who wrote a really fascinating essay, personal essay, about this topic. And the topic is about him, always feeling that something was missing in his world, feeling this profound sense of isolation, this disconnect, and he learned I believe he learned in his 20s that he in fact had an identical twin who died at childbirth. And he did not know his entire life, until he was a grown adult person. And how that really explained that sense of, disconnect, something missing. And I just thought I'd toss that into the discussion because, man.
Well, and it works in this book because, not to give away any plot points, but that's what keeps the heroine moving forward, is she knows that the truth is not out there yet. And
yeah.
Yeah.
And also I wanted to kind of circle back on what you were talking about, Carole, towards the beginning of the talk about memory. I found that really interesting. And I came across this great quote that has stuck with me. I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was somebody, it doesn't matter, but the quote was, "Memory is more poet than reporter." And I thought, do you remember who that was, Jayne?
No, but it's a great line. I'm going to remember that one.
Yeah.
I can steal that. Carole, can you tell us a little bit more just about your background? Were you trained in the field of psychology, or just an amateur student of it, an observer?
Yeah, no. I get very obsessive about research. No, I'm actually, my background is scientific. I remember at school, my best subjects were English and physics, and my parents are teachers. And the idea of becoming a teacher filled me with absolute horror. And I thought, if I study English, that's what's going to happen to me. So I studied physics. And I actually spent 20 years working in oncology in a hospital, so treating cancer patients with radiation therapy. And I did that for many, many years. And I wrote as a hobby, really, the weekends and evenings. I did that right up until, I think it would have been about 2017, something like that. And then I just, an awful lot of things happened in my life all at once. I got quite ill. A lot of family members became ill or died. And it was a real sort of, well, if I'm going to do this, because I've always wanted to be a writer, I've always wanted to do it, but my job just took everything really. I could write at weekends, but it was never very much. In the evenings, I was usually too tired. And I thought, right, if I'm going to do it, I just have to do it. So we blew all of our savings, my husband and I, we left our jobs. We moved to the island of Cyprus, which is in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. It's maybe about, I think, 3.5 or 4 hours by plane from the UK. And that's where I wrote Mirrorland. I really just kind of went, right, that's it. You know, I'm completely changing my life. If this doesn't work, I will go back to my job in oncology. But if it doesn't, then I'll just keep writing. And so that's at the moment what I'm doing. I've just kept writing. And when I came back from Cyprus, I moved back to Scotland. When I was working in oncology, I lived in England. So I've lived in England about 20 years and just moved back to Scotland. So yes, my background is nothing really to do with psychology at all, or writing, or anything like that.
Well, it's funny you anticipate my next question, which is we always have aspiring writers who are tuning into these programs, looking for little pearls of wisdom and things like that. I'm going to ask both of you this question, of course. But you first, Carole. I like how you said, you used what you had. You had the house, you had twins, and you fashioned this into this incredible story. Do you have any other kind of general advice for people who, like yourself before, always wanted to write but had never committed to it?
I mean, I know everybody's different, but I really recommend trying short story writing, if only because you can sell short stories fairly quickly. You can immediately get feedback. You can see where you're going right. You can see where you're going wrong. I think that it teaches you an awful lot about writing, and also about the publishing industry in general. I think as well, it's a good way of writing in lots of different genres, because you never really know, I think, what you will write the best in, or what's actually your voice, what's actually your story, until I think you've tried lots and lots of different things. And short story writing is excellent for that. That's what sort of anybody that is thinking of trying to write a novel, I usually say, try and write some short stories first, see if you like it, or even some long short stories. And then the main thing really is resilience. I mean, I've been rejected so many times over the years, hundreds of times probably now, not just with short stories, but with Mirrorland. I was rejected so many times, first of all by agents, and then by publishers. You have to kind of develop this thick skin where, one, you can take on board criticism. You can see when it's merited and when perhaps it isn't, and you can make changes, or you can decide not to make changes. You have to be able to learn that skill, because I think that a lot of writers give up because they just think, oh, I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. And a lot of the time you don't get feedback. You don't get, you just get form rejections. You don't get feedback from publishers. So you have to be able to work it out yourself. You have to be able to eventually become your own best critic, if that makes sense. And I think that a lot of writers would, if you just keep going and going and going for years, you will get there. It's just that a lot of the time people stop and they give up.
Did you find that it took you a while to find your own voice?
Yes, definitely. I mean, even when I was writing short stories, every short story, I think, for the first 4 or 5 years was Stephen King. I was writing in Stephen King's voice. I was writing the kind of stories that Stephen King would write. And that was great, though, because I think that you have to do that. I think all writers write in one of their favorite authors' voices before they find their own kind of niche, their own voice. I would say that he and Agatha Christie are probably my favorite writers of all time. And so everything I wrote was a bit of both, or one or the other. And then eventually you realize, without even kind of realizing, that you're not doing that anymore. But it takes a while. I think that for a long time, you write in the voices that you love, and you hope that eventually you will write in your own voice instead.
How about you, Jayne?
Yeah, I was going to say what she said. Except for the short story part, I probably should have done that because it did take me a long time to get published as a novelist. In hindsight, had I to do it over. But I would say that finding your author's voice is the single most important thing you can do. And then once you find it, sharpen it, hone it, make it stronger, find the parts that work and run with them. One of the best lectures I ever had over the phone from a friend when I was feeling bad because I couldn't do the more emotional drama that was popular at the time because I write light. I write light. There's just no getting around it. And she said, Jayne, she said, I can't write light. I can't write light, and Jayne cannot write dark. And that's what it is. And you go with it and figure out how to make the best of it, of whichever direction you go. And so finding your own voice really is it's just a huge bonus benefit once you have that in your mind and you know what you're doing. Changes everything. You're right, Carole.
Do you find Jayne that, because you've written under several different pseudonyms, do you find that allows you to express different sides of your psyche, or is that putting too much meaning into it?
People will tell me I sound different in the three worlds that I write in. Carole, if you don't know me, I write futuristic, I write historicals, and I write the 1930s right now, and then contemporaries. I don't see it. To me, it's all my voice. And I don't see the difference in the three worlds. But readers will tell me I sound different, so I don't know. From my point of view, it's everything fundamentally is still whatever I do all three worlds. I don't have a lot of options. I am what I am.
Well, it's funny, just by listening to both of you, I've learned an awful lot about the Gothic genre. It's funny, Barbara, who would normally be with us today, she's been talking about this resurgence of the Gothic for quite a while now. She's always kind of has that visionary look. And, just thinking about how there are stories floating around out there in the air all the time, and people respond to a different type of story at different times. So it's been really interesting hearing you both discuss that, and what an intimate form it is. I didn't really think of it in those terms. But I have a few questions from the audience, but before we get to that, the importance of, with the Gothic, the house, which you've touched upon. Do you find that, I've always found this subject fascinating, places where, it doesn't necessarily have to be a house, it can be a battlefield, it can be, a place where something very, very traumatic has occurred, Gettysburg or any Civil War battlefield, or a house, where, horrible crime has been committed. Not to get too out there in the ether, but it seems like places can retain some sort of weird energy. Do you agree?
I don't think there's any lack of people who will tell you that they can walk into a new place they've never been before and get a weird vibe.
Yeah.
Everybody's had that experience. Where's the line between intuition and imagination? And, it's a fine line. So I vote for, there is a psychic element in there somewhere.
Right.
But then
I would. I would agree completely. I've never personally had, a sort of psychic experience or anything like that, but I definitely think that certain places have vibes. Some have good vibes, some have bad vibes. I think that houses, in particular really old houses, they're less haunted by ghosts than by what's happened in that house, by all the things it's witnessed. I mean, when you think about it, it is quite crazy. If you think of houses that are thousands and thousands, or hundreds of years old, or places that are thousands of years old, it's fascinating. There's no way that they can't retain, or that they don't retain something, some feeling, definitely.
Well, here in the US, if there's been like a murder in the house that you're trying to sell, it goes on the declaration. It's like,
Really?
it's real hard to sell a house there's been a murder in. Yeah, I mean,
Wow.
Yeah.
so,
When you
Gosh.
think about the French countryside, it's like every square foot of that terrain, is soaked in blood. I mean, I hate to put a nasty element to it, but just that history for centuries. But I digress. Let me get to some of these questions here. Okay, yeah, this is for Carole. Debbie has an interesting question. She says, did you need to move to Cyprus to be able to write the book instead of staying where you were? There's
I
the
think,
whole exile tradition there.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that maybe 50% of it was this dream. I'd always had this dream of a very cliched writer's dream, I suppose, of moving to a Greek island and writing my novel. I'd always wanted to do it. I could have stayed in Essex, which was where I lived at the time. But I think that, I think that I could have written it. I don't know is the answer. I think probably, yes, I could have stayed where I was, but I'm glad I didn't, because it wasn't just leaving my job, it was leaving my life. It was a proper kind of commitment. And so I had to see it through. I think perhaps if I'd stayed, there would have been quite a big chance, because I'm quite risk averse, that I would have gone, oh, what have I done? And kind of go back to my life, go back to my job, go back to everything that I knew. Whereas this way, I was about as far away from it as I could get. And so it meant that I just, every day I got up and I wrote, and that was my day, that was my job. And it was wonderful. I mean, until the money ran out, until all of our savings were gone and we had to come home, it was great. I loved every minute of it.
Claire has a question. She says, did you ever consider writing from Elle's point of view? How might Mirrorland have been different from her perspective?
So I suppose in some ways I did, because I used her diaries as a kind of vehicle for readers to get to know her and what she thought. I think that the characters of Kat and Elle are very opposite, even though they're identical, they're opposite. So Kat is the sister who used fantasy to survive her childhood, but then who never kind of went on to process it properly. She essentially still lives in a fantasy world. She doesn't have a future. She just lives in the present. She doesn't have a past. She's very much in denial. Whereas with Elle, she also used fantasy to get through her childhood, but then she did process it in reality. So her entire life is about confrontation and the truth. And I actually think that would have made for a slightly less interesting story, because Kat is a very unreliable narrator. She doesn't have, her memories are all over the place. They're part fantasy, they're part real. She can't trust herself, whereas Elle very much does. Elle always knows what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's not. So I didn't ever think about writing from Elle's perspective as a first person at all, apart from in terms of her diary extracts.
Right. I've had a couple of questions about, have you sold the film rights yet?
I have.
Excellent.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
No more day job.
No, fingers crossed. It was the first thing to go. I think it was why the book went to auction in the US and the UK, because I sold it was actually the TV series rights that I sold first. So it's like a joint US UK venture. It's Heyday TV in the UK. Heyday Films are the production company behind the Harry Potter movies. And then in the US, it's NBC Universal. So they've got this sort of joint venture. So I think that selling the rights to them, it was a preempt before I sold the books, was what got the book sold, if you see what I mean. So it was a bit kind of back to front. But yeah, and I would absolutely love it to happen. I know these things don't always happen. but yeah, fingers crossed that it does.
Any casting choices? If you're
Do you know,
ideal.
everyone always asks me that, and I'm so bad at it because in my head they look the way the characters look in my head. It's so hard for me to imagine somebody else in that role. I think, you know, if they make it set in Scotland, because who knows, they might not. I really like the actress Karen Gillam, who's a Scottish actress. She was in Jumanji.
Oh, yeah.
I know she was in lots of other things, but that's the only one I can think of. And I think in terms of Ross, I think there are a lot more options in terms of him. There is a Scottish actor called Richard Madden who played Robb Stark in Game of Thrones.
Okay.
He does quite a lot of drama in the UK. I think he would be great as Ross, because Ross is quite a complex character. You know, he has lots of different sides to him, and as an actor, he does that really well. Or alternatively, Jamie in Outlander. I like him a lot.
Right. What's his name? Sam Heughan?
I think so. Yes, I went a complete blank. I couldn't think of what his name was, but yes,
Yeah.
I think so.
That's great. Jayne, can you tell us, since you have your new book coming out in less than a month now,
Yes.
tell us a little bit about your new book.
Thank you. The title is The Lady Has a Past, and the story is another one of my Amanda Quick 1930s historicals. We now call the 1930s historical. And I'm just having a blast with these 1930s books. You know, I hasten to say I am not doing the history of the 1930s. I am doing the Hollywood fantasy version of the 1930s because I write light. And that repartee for the movies, the clothes, the cars, it just all works for me. It suits my voice. So I'm excited about this one. And for those who have read the other books in the series, this is Raina Kirk's story, or at least part of her story. So she's the town's private investigator.
What else do you have going on project-wise?
Yeah. Well, I've got All the Colors of Night, which you graciously held up earlier.
And I will hold up again.
For which there are some signed copies left at the Poison Pen. Yeah, there we go. Oh, no more dark signing pages. I'm going to tell my my publisher, no more dark signing pages. There was no place to write my name on. And that's the second one in my Fog Lake trilogy. And I will just say that all of these books that I'm writing now, they've all got a strong psychic vibe. I just love working with that psychic vibe. So I'm really in that world right now.
Fantastic. Well, thanks both of you. It's been a really wonderful hour. And congratulations, Carole, on the publication of your new book. Very exciting. And Jayne, see you in a few weeks. Thanks so much for agreeing to come in and do such a wonderful job hosting. We really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure, and it was great to meet you, Carole. Great to meet you. Yeah. All the best with Mirrorland and the next one, the mystery book.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hopefully for book 2, they'll bring you over to the States and trot you around the country. We'd love to have you.
Well, I was supposed to be coming over this spring, so I'm very sad that I didn't get to. But yeah, hopefully next time.
Well, we sure would like to have you out here.
Thank you.
All right. And thanks everybody for tuning in. We really appreciate it. This will be recorded as a podcast as well. It's kind of cool. We extract the audio portion and put that out there as a podcast. And then I'll have this up on YouTube as well. So all different choices. Thanks so much again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.